This is Rick Malone for the San Francisco Symphony. Imagine yourself in Vienna in 1805, in a world in which the loudest sound you hear on a daily basis, aside from the occasional cannon fire, is the clip-clop of horses' hooves on cobblestones. You've settled into your seat in the Theater an der Wien to hear Ludwig van Beethoven's newest symphony, his third. Every one of Beethoven's works has surprised its audience in some way. What will it be this time? Right from the beginning, with those two chords crashing louder than any other sound, it's clear that this symphony will be like nothing you have ever heard before. After a private premiere the year before, Haydn's friend Carl August Griesinger had written to the great publishing house of Breitkopf and Härtel to recommend that the company buy rights to Beethoven's Third Symphony as soon as possible. Here is more than Haydn and Mozart. Here the symphony poem is brought to a higher plateau, he wrote, and he was right. Beethoven's Third Symphony did mark a dramatic advance beyond the symphonies of Haydn and Mozart. It moved the art of the symphony into a new realm of possibility, released from the structural rules of 18th century form, and it opened the floodgates not only for Beethoven himself, but for Schubert, Mendelssohn, Schumann, Berlioz, Liszt, Brahms, Bruckner, and the rest of the great 19th century symphonists. As early as 1797, Beethoven had begun thinking about writing some kind of musical tribute to Napoleon. Beethoven was a political idealist who viewed Napoleon as a sort of modern Prometheus, bringing social enlightenment to humankind, and he decided that he would not just dedicate this new work to Napoleon, he would actually name it after him. But in the spring of 1804, just as Beethoven completed his symphonic tribute, the news arrived that Napoleon had crowned himself emperor. The great hope of republicanism had seized power as a dictator. According to Beethoven's pupil Ferdinand Ries, he flew into a rage, shouting, "Is even he nothing but an ordinary man? Now he will also trample upon human rights and become a slave to his own ambition. Now he will set himself above all other men and become a tyrant." Beethoven went to the table, wrote Ries, grabbed the top of the title page, tore it in two, and threw it to the floor. The first page was rewritten, and the symphony was then, for the first time, given the title of Sinfonia Eroica. End quote. It would become a theme of Beethoven's life that individuals could never live up to his idealizations. In the end, he preferred humankind in the abstract to humans in the flesh. Appropriately enough, this was the piece that began Beethoven's heroic period, in which he experimented not only with melody and form, but with scale and proportion. The Eroica is about a third longer than any symphony written to that point, a fact which was quite a topic of discussion among both musicians and audience members at the time. But it starts with an introduction of just two notes. In Beethoven's time, the development section of a symphony was usually shorter than the opening exposition. But Beethoven has so many ideas to explore here, secondary and even tertiary melodies, dissonant chords, syncopated rhythms, that it's the development that takes up the bulk of the opening movement. The progression of the movement is full of twists and turns, one of which led to a legendary incident that must have been fearsome at the time. In the midst of the movement, Beethoven writes what sounds like a false entrance for the horn. but it's really a signal for what comes next. Ferdinand Ries wrote, "The first rehearsal of the symphony was terrible, but the hornist did in fact come in on cue. I was standing next to Beethoven and, believing that he had made a wrong entrance, I said, 'That damned hornist, can't he count? It sounds frightfully wrong.' I believe I was in danger of getting my ears boxed. Beethoven did not forgive me for a long time." End quote. The second movement Funeral March was seen as epic even from the first performance. As Michael Steinberg says, its ceaseless pace perhaps suggests the Promethean sufferings and inevitable demise of those who support heroic achievements. It was played at the funerals of Felix Mendelssohn, Arturo Toscanini, and Franklin D. Roosevelt, among other titans. If there is a direct tie-in to the subject of Napoleon in the symphony, this is probably it. And in fact, when Beethoven heard of Napoleon's death in 1821, he said, "I wrote the music for that sad event 17 years ago." Music like this was unfortunately too familiar to listeners in a Europe that seemed almost constantly at war or in revolt. It's similar to funeral marches by French composers of the Revolutionary era. But not everything is tragic. There is an interlude in C major, lyrical at first, then triumphal. And there is even an elaborate fugue. As in the first movement, Beethoven uses his themes as more than just melodies. They are raw material to be fragmented and transformed for emotional effect. The funereal atmosphere is completely dispersed with the beginning of the scherzo. Which starts with quietly skittering strings and builds to properly heroic size. Most symphonies of the time used only 2 horns, but when they enter here, we know why Beethoven calls for 3. Their heroic fanfare opens the contrasting trio section. Then the scurrying returns, leading to a quick and quirky coda. The finale opens with a chaotic outburst. It pauses for breath and then introduces a theme that Beethoven first used, appropriately enough, in his ballet The Creatures of Prometheus 4 years earlier. whispered at first and occasionally interrupted loudly and somewhat rudely. The theme divides itself in two, treble and bass, and Beethoven gives voice only to the bass line at first. When he superimposes the real melody above it, we get the unusual sensation of hearing a theme growing organically as we listen, from its individual elements into its fully formed state. The theme goes through 12 variations that make up a virtual textbook of late classical early romantic style, from fugue to military march. A symphonic finale in Beethoven's time was usually a throwaway, light and breezy. The variations that conclude the Eroica act as a kind of destination for the journey of the entire symphony, a resolution of built-up tensions, a psychological point of arrival, and a model for the drama that all future composers of symphonies would try to emulate. Vienna was divided at first about the Eroica. Some saw it for the revolution that it was, others thought it was just Beethoven trying too hard to be shocking and innovative. 150 years later, Leonard Bernstein called the first two movements perhaps the greatest two movements in all of symphonic music. And now we know it as the piece that began the Romantic era and set the stage for all symphonies to come. And to think, Breitkopf and Härtel, the publisher, decided to pass on Beethoven's new symphony. This is Rick Malone for the San Francisco Symphony.